Welcome to We Do the Heavy Lifting. I'm your host, Dr. Jenna Yentis, and today we do breathing. Breathing happens for all of us. We don't even think about it. It's happening 24 hours a day. I guess you really could think about it and change your breath, but how does that affect performance? Our expert today is Mr. Bo Sandoval. He is the Assistant Athletic Director for Strength and Conditioning at Texas A&M University, and you have quite the resume of athletes that you've worked with. You've worked with college champions, national champions, Paralympians, Olympians, professional athletes. How in the world did you get into breathing?
That's a good question. I think when everyone refers to strength and conditioning, due to the popularity or how it earned its popularity in the sporting industry, they think barbells, they think resistance training, they think cardiovascular stress. And those are all great stimulus. We learn that through our education. We learn a diversity of skills to be able to apply certain stimulus based on what the needs analysis is telling us for the individual or for the group or the team. And so as you're going through that, you quickly realize that stimulus requires a few things. There's some prerequisites to optimize what that stimulus has in terms of an effect. And so fueling is part of that. And typically when we get into fueling, we learn from our dietetics professionals and our sports nutritionists about certain types of fuel for certain types of activity. And it's usually around fat metabolization or carbohydrate metabolization or protein synthesis and things along those lines. But we know that we can go a few days without food and we'd be just fine. We can go a couple of days with no water and we'll survive. We can't go more than a few minutes without oxygen. And it is often perceived as this necessity, but I think we forget that it's a fuel source, and it is one of the primary fuel sources that supports all of our energy systems. And so as I was going through my career, luckily I was around people that are a lot smarter than me, and the influence came on pretty quick around optimizing oxygen uptake, because we started diving into step assessments, whether we're evaluating VO2 maximums and metabolic assessments. Well, we're often evaluating an exchange between O2 and CO2. I think the early conversations for me were around, okay, we know we're trying to get rid of CO2. Is there an equal mechanism around tolerating it? How can we split that learning curve between learning how to get rid of it and learning how to tolerate it simultaneously? And then that also kind of drugged me down a few rabbit holes with some key professionals around, well, then how do you optimize oxygen intake? And one of the first things I kind of learned on was mechanical, which resonates really well with me because my whole career applying stimulus, it's usually based on some sort of mechanic. When you're doing a resistance training regimen, there are mechanics involved for efficiency and optimal power output and rate of force development. When you get into energy economy with cardiovascular training, you learn quickly about mechanics and mechanical processes. It had just never been broken down to me, the mechanical necessities of breathing. And so that was probably the first rabbit hole I went into, was what's proper breathing mechanics. And depending on what subculture you subscribe to, you'll hear everything from words like belly breathing and diaphragmatic control and other reference points trying to explain mechanics. And ultimately what we're trying to do is to use our musculature, all of it, not just our diaphragm, to be able to optimize intake. What's the most volume we can take in, knowing that not everything that we're consuming is O2. There's other stuff in the air. But that gives us the best chance. First, can we just take it in? Can you take it in? And you start recognizing with a variety of athletes that some of them are shallow breathers. They don't take in very much. Well, that already limits us in terms of what we can provide for stimulus, because we're limited at what they're able to fuel with in terms of O2. Even for the anaerobic athlete or the more metabolic athlete, take a wrestler, for example, they're really good at swimming around in lactate. We've got data points on them operating pretty technically at some really high levels of lactate. and still being able to hold a conversation and still being able, which most people, once you get past that 12, 13, 14 millimoles of lactate, it becomes hard to talk. My legs are on fire, and and we've witnessed some amazing human beings, both through the Olympic teams and development programs, and even elite college programs they're running around accumulating minutes at 16 plus millimoles of lactate, which that's like lava running through your veins. And when you look at other metrics around their VT2 and looking in a step test, their thresholds are much higher, meaning they can prolong that effect, that degradation effect, for longer. And so when you start digging into it, well, they're pretty good at using oxygen. They're using oxygen as an agent to assist with buffering, the whole buffering process. So then for me as a practitioner, it extrapolates into, okay, well, if I know I need this person to be more metabolically fit in order to help push that during certain phases of training, as we periodize our training throughout the year, I want to identify opportunities where I can optimize their O2 system. So where will we do lower intensity, longer bouts of cardiovascular activity that's appropriate for their sport? I'm not a big, I don't take a bunch of non-runners on a lot of running, because mechanically they'll just beat themselves up. And vice versa, you take someone that's a pure runner and try to mix in other things that can kind of take away from their economy as well. So you've got to mix and match the modality to be able to give you the return that you're after. But once we can establish a solid O2 base, an aerobic base, later on that transfers very well into more metabolic capacity, and then we can apply intensity as we go. If their ceiling height is very low in terms of their aerobic base, it's very difficult to push volume from a metabolic standpoint, because they quickly begin to drown in that lactate accumulation. And so as we reverse engineer that, the most primal functional thing that they got to be able to do first is mechanically, they've got to be able to breathe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we look at mechanics, and I keep it really simple. I've got some great colleagues in that field that this is all they study. And so for me as a practitioner, like, what are the most concise things I can get through to an athlete to be able to express, these are quality mechanics, these are not, or you're doing this one thing, we need to address that one thing. And we start out by using their nose, basically closing their mouth and using their nose. The nose it's a built-in regulator. Not as much volume will pass through, and so you're forced to use more musculature to bring air in. And so when we do things simple in the beginning, like part of our warm-up, we're using nasal breathing only to cause an inflammatory response where we're opening up the lungs, opening up the chest cavity, getting the rib cage to expand more. And then we talk to them about other things to try to target, like to really try to imagine your torso is like a balloon, and you want to fill up like the back left corner. So really thinking about your back, the upper rear end of your rib cage expanding as you're taking that air in. And so as they visualize and feel, they can start to push out on certain areas of their torso and start to realize, like, oh, I got more room than I thought. I got more of a bladder down there than I thought I did. And so over time, this repetition becomes kind of refreshing and energizing, because they're basically getting a shot of O2 as they're going through this. And then that can translate into other methods on other breathing mechanics, tempos, and mixing in nasal and mouth breathing together, because eventually we will get into, once mechanics become better, we'll start getting into different modes of CO2 tolerance. We can always influence fitness through a variety of modalities, playing around with volumes and intensities and kind of riding that roller coaster as it's appropriately concurrent with their sport training, their skill specific training. And so while we're doing that, we're looking for opportunities to be able to spike not only O2 consumption or the respiratory rate, but also spike things like heart rate, and get them to understand and learn the relationship between the two. Because your breathing can be effective in positively influencing heart rate, and heart rate can be a good indicator of whether or not you're doing your due diligence with your breathing. And so they all start to fit hand in hand once the basics are covered. So in terms of, back to the original question, how did I get into breathing? Well, I knew I wanted to apply all this mechanical stimulus. I quickly learned that in order to do that, I need to be familiar with the O2 system and how we take in oxygen, and what, as a practitioner who gets anywhere from 60 minutes to 90 minutes at a time influencing an athlete in their training, What are the most concise ways I can go about influencing how they take oxygen in? We do know that environmental, it helps if we're able to live high and train low and simulate those types of atmospheres. But then if you don't, what else can you do? And so some of the things that I've just kind of thrown out very quickly and abbreviated, those are some of the methods that we kind of work through in a progressive fashion. The nasal breathing is one of the ones that I think shocks athletes the most. One, I don't think naturally a lot of them, they kind of grow out of it. We're very familiar with our nasal passages when we're young, when we're babies, kind of like everything else. We lose other mechanics and things after we start walking and running around from crawling and rolling over. But typically the response is they're worried about one, blowing boogers out of their nose. They're worried about that, and you got to kind of get them over that. It feels weird. They feel inflamed. You know, those nasal passages aren't used to opening up quite that much. So I don't advise doing the introductory sessions in the dead of winter when it's really cold. That'll turn them off pretty quickly. As soon as you freeze that nasal cavity a little bit. Yep. And so, but they can be conditioned for it if you do it, you know, little by little. So start indoors, start in a pretty controlled environment. And then the other thing too is one of the greatest areas to practice breathing is bedtime. One, when we can control our breathing, we can get into a relaxed state a little bit quicker, and they can actually positively influence our sleep. The other is for optimal sleep, we do want to continue to expand our cavity as much as we can. So being familiar with nasal breathing while we're sleeping, there's a lot of positive benefits to that. So in the beginning, that's difficult for some people because as soon as they relax, their mouth opens up. And so they're unconscious. They don't, they don't know. They can't control that. So an easy way is we just have them tape their mouth shut. There's actually companies now that manufacture, it's almost like a Band-Aid, but it goes comfortably around the mouth and it doesn't hurt when you peel it off your face kind of thing. But it's designed just to keep your lips together so that you have to breathe through your nose, inhale and exhalation while you're sleeping. When we typically have that intervention, it's almost immediate. Once they get 3, 4, 5 days in a row of consistent sleep habits with nasal breathing only, it's usually pretty rapid how quickly that transfers into activity. Meaning now we go through a warm-up, like I mentioned before, and we're nasal breathing only, and it's almost effortless to them. It actually feels better to them because it's better activation, a better stimulus for all of their, not only musculature, but their fueling systems to kind of get everything ramped up, the metabolic process ramped up. And so the two work really well hand in hand together. And I don't know if how many competitive athletes you've been around, but quite a few, large percentage have struggles with sleep as well. So it's kind of a double-edged sword positively that we can help them out with in terms of understanding that. Breathing, definitely. I mean, it is, I mentioned the word rabbit hole. It is a universe, as you know, with your studies. There are so many aspects to get into. I spend a majority of my time really trying to prioritize things that we can influence other aspects of training. It is a difficult topic for whatever reason to get athletes, especially youth athletes, young athletes, 18 to 22-year-olds, sold on the idea that economical breathing can equate into improved elite performance. It's one of those things like, I think when we're young, we know the things that are bad for us, whatever bad habits, staying out too late, alcohol, whatever you name those things. It's not until we're much older that we start to value like, well, I only get this body once. I should probably take care of it so that I can. Yeah. So when it comes to breathing, you think like, oh, well, everybody breathes. It's a natural thing. I breathe. I've been breathing for 41 years. Right. So they kind of overlook it, and it can be a difficult thing to kind of influence. And once you have that first light bulb moment where they're doing something that they may have historically struggled with just because you've optimized breathing, it can be a pretty impactful thing. I often say too, kind of like strength training, if keeping your same physiology you have right now as you stand right in front of me, if I can just improve mechanically how you move, I can in fact have you apply more strength than what you could prior to meeting me. So we can do the same thing with breathing. Based on your fitness level, whatever metric we used right now, through simply having a quick intervention and improving mechanically how you breathe, we can essentially make you more fit without any training, exactly as you stand right now. So I try to explain it that way, that technique and mechanics are as valuable as anything else, especially when we're talking something supplemental. Strength training is supplemental. It's not the sport unless you're a weightlifter or a power lifter. And so for a lot of the athletes that we work with, conditioning is supplemental. It's secondary. It's not the skill specific thing. There's some crossover there, and there's some mechanics that we try to imitate or get as close to game-like intensities and range of motion as we can. But ultimately, they're a little bit exclusive. So it's tough to get them to understand that sometimes. But the second I can relate it to, hey, what if I improved your economy right now? Like, you don't got to do 6 weeks with me. Give me 5 minutes to improve mechanically what you're doing, and I can make you stronger. Or mechanically what you're doing, and I can make you fitter. That typically is like, huh? This sounds like voodoo. Yeah. Okay, let me see. And it has nothing to do with any, stimulus or any tricks or anything. It's just simply showing them a better way right then, which is, if you think about it, in every sport, if I'm a running coach and I'm working with an 800-meter runner, the easiest first is without, which will take us months and months and months to work on mechanics and work on that. Strategy we can start to implement right now, because they're gonna race now. Yeah. Are they great? Are they the best they're ever going to be? No, because that's going to take a lot of training. But from a strategy standpoint, I can teach them how to race right now. I can give them 2 things to focus on to give them a better economical race. I would argue the same for a cross country runner, a downhill skier, and then over time we can influence these other things. So once I get them wrapped on that technical aspect of it, it's usually a much easier conversation. They're like, okay, well, show me this breathing thing. Show me what that is about. And it's also, once you get past, for them, it feels like it's this odd thing. Not a lot of people talk about it. Or something that they just never heard, because it's not mainstream. You don't see it. It's not on people's Instagram pages. Well, there's a couple now. There's a couple good ones out there. But for the most part, you're not watching a muscle and fitness model, talking about and just beating the drum to death about respiration. And so once we can show them quickly how impactful it can be on performance, and we start talking about elite performance to a competitive athlete, I mean, they grab a hold of that really, really quickly. So yeah, I visualize and treat it just like it's just another training modality. I've got a library of tactics we use from a resistance training standpoint, a variety of tactics that we use from a cardiovascular or metabolic standpoint. And then breathing is just a supplemental tool that we know is kind of foundational for both of those.
Awesome. Do you have any last minute words or take home message for our listeners?
Take home message. I mean, if you're in the performance world, I would just say, if I have anything, one of my assistants, he says this every now and then, but there's a quote or an old saying from Socrates that true wisdom is understanding that you know nothing.
Yep.
And I believe that this industry, if you haven't learned that by now, then that's something you should definitely learn. So the curve continues. Stick your nose into everything. It's going to find application at some point, even if it's not immediate in what you're dealing with right now. There's still a lot to be learned about the human body and training stimulus, and it's only getting better. So
it just fascinates me how much literature is published on that and how it changes and how we're still learning so much. You'd think we'd know more than we do, but it's an evolving topic.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Thank you so much, Bo, for being with us today, and thank you for being with us on We Do the Heavy Lifting. And if you have any comments from the listeners, you can contact us at huffines@tamu.edu. We are more than happy to hear about topics that you may be interested in, and we'll find the expert and cover it for you. Thank you, and stay safe and stay healthy. All right.
Very good.
We're good.
Nice.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.